Part 10. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 91. Be honest and lie as little as possible, because telling one lie often requires countless lies to cover it up. Tang Ning couldn't explain now. Why did he come to Jian County Government Office to solve the case? But he told Li Tianlan just 2 days ago that he didn't know how to solve crimes. He looked at Li Tianlan and asked casually, "What is Mr. Li doing here?" Li Tianlan looked at the inner hall and said, "The things lost this time are not trivial. I'm here to see how the case is being investigated." Zhou Mingli had already walked to the door, looked back and said, "Ning come in." Tang Ning walked into the hall, and Li Tianlan thought for a while and followed her in. Zhou Mingli handed him a booklet and said, "This is the file they compiled. You can take a look first." Tang Ning looked at Li Tianlan and explained, "I just took a look." Li Tianlan looked at Zhou Mingli and then at him, with a thoughtful look on his face. This case was taken very seriously by the local government, and there were many files recorded on it. Tang Ning picked out the important ones to read. They first arrested all the well-known habitual thieves in Lingzhou City, and then used the elimination method to eliminate those with alibi one by one. In the end, only 3 people remained. The time and place of the crime matched, and the 3 of them were habitual thieves, so there was at least an 80% chance that they were responsible. But these 3 people, no matter how they were interrogated or tortured, firmly denied that they had stolen the items. Tang Ning thought for a moment, and if it were him, he wouldn't admit it. The fact that the matter was so big was obviously different from an ordinary theft case. It could not be settled by getting slapped with a few slaps and being held in jail for a few days. Maybe, my whole life and my life will have to be involved. Tang Ning finished reading the file and put it down. Zhou Mingli and Zhao Zhija both looked over, and Li Tianlan never took his eyes away from him from beginning to end. He looked at Li Tianlan, and Li Tianlan looked at him, and the atmosphere was slightly awkward. Li Tianlan thought for a while and said, "If Tang Jiwen has any ideas, you might as well tell him." Miss Li was very popular because she knew how to give people a pass. Tang Ning thought for a moment and said, "First, ask those 3 habitual thieves whether they stole the envoy's belongings. If we can ask, why are we still standing here?" A policeman looked at him, then looked at Zhao Zhija, and said, "Master Zhao, those 3 people have been tortured, and there is no result, so don't let them go. It's a waste of time. Let your people think carefully. Is there anyone else who has been missed?" Zhao Zhija looked at him and said, "There is no rush. Why not let Tang Jiwen give it a try?" The head catcher named Xiu crossed his arms and looked at Zhao Zhija with an indifferent expression. When the deadline came, it was Zhao Zhija who was in trouble, not him. He just liked it. When she reached the door of the prison, Tang Ning turned around and said, "Everyone, just stay here and leave 3 detectives to go in with me." Zhou Mingli, Zhao Zhija, and others originally wanted to go in together, but when he opened his mouth, they had to wait outside. Zhao Zhija selected 3 agents to go in with him. Li Tianlan stretched out his hand, stopped the last one, and said, "The thing that the mission lost is not its unusual. I'll go in with Tang Jiwen." The county jail was naturally not a good place. When Tang Ning walked in, she was hit by a musty smell. He looked back and saw Li Tianlan following him, but without saying anything, he looked at a police officer behind him and asked, "Where are the 3 of them being held?" The catcher immediately said, "Tang Jiwen, please come with me." Tang Ning followed him and soon arrived at a cell. He looked at the 3 people leaning against the wall and asked in surprise, "The 3 of them are locked together like this?" The policeman looked at him suspiciously and asked, "What's going on?" Tang Ning sighed and said, "Find 2 more cells and separate them. The cells should be far apart." Although the policeman didn't know his intention, Mr. Zhao had already given instructions before he came in. Everything was arranged by Tang Jiwen. He looked at the 2 jailers beside him and said, Find 2 more cells, farther apart. Yes, separate them. The 2 jailers opened the cell door, walked to the 3 men, looked at 2 of them, and shouted, "You 2, get up." In the frightened eyes of the 3 people, the 2 jailers dragged 2 of them out and locked them in the 2 cells farthest apart on the east and west sides. Tang Ning walked into the cell, and the remaining man was already shouting loudly, "Sir, we are unjustly accused. We really did not steal the things." Tang Ning walked up to the man and asked, "Do you know what will happen to the person who stole things this time?" The man shook his head with a look of horror on his face. Those who threw the things were the Chu envoys. The things they threw were very important. Tang Ning looked at him and said, "You have also seen that the entire Lingzhou is turned upside down. If you are caught, your head will be lost. It's all dead anyway. If I stole it, I wouldn't say anything, not even to death." Li Tianlan looked at him and frowned slightly. The envoy seal was of no small importance. It was related to the handover of tributes. If it was really lost, the entire mission would not be able to bear the consequences. And what he said strengthened the man's determination not to say anything. "Don't take chances." Tang Ning looked at him, sighed, and said, "If you do this, someone will lose your head. It's related to the diplomatic relations between the 2 countries, and the 9 tribes involved are insignificant. Regardless of this, which of the 3 of you brothers did this, and none of you can escape." The man panicked and said, "Sir, we really don't have." "Now I'll give you a chance." Tang Ning waved her hand, interrupted him, and said, "To be honest with you, even if you confess, it's impossible to let you out. But for the sake of your surrender, I will close the door. In 2 or 3 years, I can release you, and after 2 or 3 years, you will be a good man again." When he said this, his voice changed, "But if the other 2 people confess first, then you will have to wait for 18 more years. Of course, whether you can be reincarnated as a hero in your next life depends on your luck." Tang Ning noticed that a look of extreme panic flashed across the face of the man in front of her for a moment. Although he quickly calmed down, his clenched fists and slightly trembling body showed that he was not feeling well in his heart. Not peaceful. The man subconsciously looked to the left and right, but there were only 2 walls. He looked at Tang Ning and said in a trembling voice, "Sir, we don't." "It doesn't matter." Tang Ning waved her hand and said, "You still have some time to think about it. I'll ask the other 2. After saying that, he didn't look at the man again, turned around and walked out of the cell door. Li Tianlan glanced at the man who was lying limply on the ground, turned around and walked out. After walking out of that cell, Tang Ning did not go to the other 2 cells, but stood a little further away and waited. Li Tianlan looked at him and said, "Those 3 are brothers. Will your method work?" Whether it is useful or not is not for Tang Ning to say. As a very representative example in game theory, the prisoner's dilemma has long been verified by a large number of experiments. When life is at stake and there is only one chance, brothers may not be reliable. Tang Ning looked at her, smiled and said, "We'll find out later if it's useful." Li Tianlan looked at him and asked, "Didn't Tang Jiwen say he didn't understand how to solve cases?" "This has nothing to do with solving crimes." Tang Ning looked at her and said, "This involves a profound knowledge called game theory. This knowledge can be applied to all aspects of life, and solving crimes is only one of its applications. If Mr. Li, if you're interested, I can tell you in detail when I have time." "Tomorrow." Li Tianlan looked at him and said, "I will have time tomorrow." Tang Ning froze on the spot. Are all Chu people so upright? In Chenguo, have time actually means no time, which is just a polite way of saying it. It's like I'll treat you to dinner another day. This sentence means that I don't have time to treat you to dinner today, and I probably won't have time in the future. It's just that it's not good to express this meaning in person, so it needs to be expressed in a euphemistic way. He looked at Li Tianlan and said with some embarrassment, "I'm really sorry, I have something to do tomorrow." The day after tomorrow. Li Tianlan looked at him and asked, does Tang Jiwen have time the day after tomorrow? The day after tomorrow. Tang Ning was still a little embarrassed. The day after tomorrow. Li Tianlan looked at him and asked, is there anything going on the day after tomorrow? The water thrown out by his words was difficult to recover. Tang Ning did not expect that the Chu envoy was not only idle, but also persistent. He sighed, looked at her and said, then it will be the day after tomorrow. Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 92. Outside the prison, officials from Yian County were anxiously waiting. Although County Magistrate Zhao could hold up the sky, if something really happened, the Yian County Magistrate and the County Lieutenant would also be implicated, especially the Yian County Lieutenant in charge of public security. Once the Chu envoy reported the case, his position would be over. They wanted to go in and see what was going on, but they were afraid of disturbing Tang Jiwen, and they were very conflicted. Not far away, Governor Dong strode over, and his voice arrived before he arrived. How is the case going? Have the envoy's things been found? Sir Dong Captain Chiu bowed to him, looked inside the cell, and said, the things have not been found yet. Tang Jiwen is interrogating the suspect inside. Tang Jiwen, interrogating. Nonsense. Governor Dong was stunned for a moment, his face darkened, and he looked at Zhao Zhija and questioned, this case is extraordinary and of great importance. How can Magistrate Zhao treat it like a joke? He was not targeting anyone at the moment. If it was an ordinary theft case, it would be fine. But it happened to involve the envoy of Chu. If this case was not handled well, the pressure from above would be directly imposed on him. He had been sitting in the position of governor of Lingzhou for a long time, and he was still thinking about climbing up. Now, it's good that he can stay where he is, which is already a blessing. Zhao Zhija clasped his fists and said, Tang Jiwen is very smart, even Lord Song Qiansong praised him highly. Lord Dong might as well wait a little longer to see what the final result will be. When Zhao Zhija mentioned Song Qian, Governor Dong's heart moved, and then he remembered that Tang Jiwen was highly praised by Lord Song Qiansong, the chief judge of Jingdong Road, and he must have some ability. His expression eased, and he glanced at Zhou Mingli and Zhao Zhija, and said, then it depends on Tang Jiwen. Inside the cell, Tang Ning estimated that the time was about right, looked at Li Tianlan, and said, Brother Li, I need your help later. Li Tianlan showed interest on his face and asked, how can I help? Tang Ning looked around and whispered a few words in her ear. A slight blush appeared on her face, and then her eyes showed a strange color and nodded. When Tang Ning walked into the cell again, the man's face was several times paler than before. He looked extremely haggard, and his forehead was covered with cold sweat, which showed how much he had struggled in his heart during the period of time. Seeing Tang Ning walk in, his body began to tremble violently, and he couldn't stop. Tang Ning pretended not to notice his abnormality, sighed, and said, the three brothers are really of one mind. Neither of them confessed. The man's face quickly turned red, and he breathed a sigh of relief. Tang Ning looked at him and asked again, are you really not going to confess? It's only 2 or 3 years since they confessed. When they confess, you will only have one knife. The man looked up at him and smiled bitterly, it wasn't us who did it. There's really no way to confess. You still have a chance. Tang Ning looked at him and was about to speak when Li Tianlan walked in from outside. He looked at the man, then at Tang Ning and said, no need to ask. Tang Ning looked at her and said in surprise, confess. Li Tianlan did not answer, but turned and walked out. Tang Ning looked at the man and sighed, there was a chance just now, but now it's gone. When he stood up and walked out, the man was terrified and trembling like a sieve. He quickly crawled to Tang Ning's feet, his face collapsed, and shouted, I confess, sir, don't kill me, I confess. Tang Ning held a piece of paper in her hand, on which was written the hiding place of the Chu envoy's thing. When the government began to arrest habitual thieves in Lingzhou City one by one, they realized that the sheep they stole was not an ordinary sheep, but a sheep from Chu. So they hid the things as soon as possible, and compared their confessions with each other, unified their statements, and firmly denied it. As habitual thieves, they have been in and out of the Yian County Jail 7 times. They are more familiar with the laws and regulations than some officials. Without any evidence, they will be released after being locked up for a few days at most, and they will be treated as if they have never seen that thing. Li Tianlan looked at Tang Ning, thought for a while, and asked, "What is this theory you just said?" "Game theory." "What is game theory?" Li Tianlan looked at Tang Ning with confusion on her face. This was the first time she heard this term today, and the person in front of him used this game theory to solve a difficult case in a short time and help them find the envoy seal. And he just said that the use of game theory is far more than that. Tang Ning thought for a moment, looked at her and said, "Game theory, in layman's terms, is a linguistic theory that animals use the addictive souls of nature to form a three-dimensional equilibrium in the space expected by decision makers." Li Tianlan thought for a long time, looked at him, and said, "Can you explain it in a more popular way?" "This is a long story." Tang Ning looked at her, waved her hand, and said, "I will explain it to you slowly later." Just now, she said something unintentionally, but she didn't expect that the girls of Chu were so straightforward. Tang Ning would explain game theory to her in detail in a few days, and there was no rush. Tang Ning looked at her again and asked, "What do you plan to do with the 3 prisoners?" Li Tianlan thought for a moment and said, "Deal with them according to the law." Everyone has a different understanding of dispose according to law. With the same sentence of dispose according to law, these 3 people may be slapped dozens of times and sent back, or they may lose 3 heads because they stretched out their hands one more time. Tang Ning didn't think it was the latter, so she looked at Li Tianlan and said, "It's good that the things are back. It's wrong for them to steal things, but it's not a crime that will lead to death. After what happened this time, those 3 people should have a psychological shadow on the profession of thieves in the future. They must always give others a chance to correct themselves. If these 3 people lose their heads because of him, a certain level in Tang Ning's heart will remain for a long time. Can't get through it?" In this matter, the envoys of Chu state had a strong say. Li Tianlan looked at him, nodded and said, "I understand, don't worry." Thinking of something, he looked at a policeman behind him and said, "Those 3 will continue to be detained separately." When Tang Ning and Li Tianlan walked out of the prison, a group of people surrounded them in front of them. "How's it going?" The first one to step forward was Governor Dong, who looked more anxious than anyone else. Tang Ning looked at him and nodded, then handed the piece of paper in her hand to Zhao Zhija and said, "The things are hidden here. Master Zhao, please send someone to take a look." Zhao Zhija took the piece of paper, looked at Tang Ning deeply, clasped his fists and said, "Thank you Tang Jiwen." Zhou Mingli breathed a sigh of relief. When he looked at Zhao Zhija, his brows furrowed, but he didn't speak again. The repairman looked at Tang Ning with a look of disbelief on his face. Several officials in Jian County breathed a sigh of relief and gathered around Zhao Zhija. Li Tianlan took a few steps to the side, looked at the middle-aged envoy, and said, "Master Zhou, go and see if the things are there first." "Yes," the envoy responded, followed by several police officers, and immediately left in a hurry. Tang Ning looked at Li Tianlan and then at the middle-aged envoy who was leaving. After thinking for a moment, she shook her head, said hello to her father-in-law, and left. He still has 2 policy papers to write today. Li Tianlan walked to Zhao Zhija and said, "Master Zhao, I have a few more words to ask the prisoners. Is it convenient?" Zhao Zhidian nodded, looked at the other 2 detectives, and said, "You accompany Mr. Li in." Less than half an hour later, when Li Tianlan walked out of the prison again, although the expression on his face was calm, there were already waves in his heart. She tried the method Tang Ning had just used on the other two people, and the results were exactly the same. The two men persisted shorter than the first man and confessed to the case. Obviously, as long as everyone refuses to say anything, the three of them will not be guilty. Why is this the result? In her heart, she became interested in game theory. Of course, she was more interested in that person. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 93. During the afternoon meal, Tang Ning had already learned from her father-in-law that the things lost by the Chu envoy had been recovered. Governor Dong originally wanted to order the three criminals to be severely punished. What was strange was that several envoys from Chu state actually pleaded for mercy at the same time. In the end, they just suffered some physical pain and were imprisoned for a period of time. The case made a lot of noise, but it ended calmly. Lingzhou City was no longer full of storms, and there were no government officials on the street asking questions when they saw anyone. The people were relieved. The third uncle's breakfast shop has since starting yesterday, business started to pick up. When business is good in the morning, Uncle San will set up some tables and chairs outside. Tang Ning ate a drawer of steamed buns, while Fang Xiaopang sat opposite him and had already eaten 3 drawers of steamed buns. The steamed buns that Uncle San used to sell were fist-sized, with thin skin and plenty of filling. 2 days ago, Tang Ning suggested that he make some steamed buns. Originally, it was just to satisfy his own appetite, plus he had promised Fang Xiaopang to treat her to them. Later, Uncle San tried to sell Xiaolongbao. Unexpectedly, it became very popular. Many people lined up in front of the steamed bun shop. There is a little girl beside Fang Xiaopang. Although she is only 4 years old, she is not as thin as an ordinary child. She looks like a shrunken Fang Xiaopang. The little girl is the daughter of Butcher Zheng next door. Butcher Zheng is busy selling meat. When Chiao is not busy, she helps him look after the children. Maybe because of sympathy for fat people, Fang Xiaopang takes good care of the little girl and often gives her his snacks. Not many people can enjoy this kind of treatment. Tang Ning counts 1, Tang Yao Yao counts half, and the last one is the little girl in front of me. A figure sat on a bench at the next table, looked up and said, "A drawer of Xiaolongbao." Tang Ning looked in that direction and saw the beggar she had met that day. The beggar who graduated from the Department of Philosophy said, "Life is like a play, if someone plays the role of an official, there will always be someone playing the role of a thief." The third uncle came out and looked at the beggar with a scrutinizing gaze. The beggar looked at him and knew what he meant. He took out a few copper coins from his arms and put them on the table. The third uncle counted the coins, put away the coins, and gave him a drawer of steamed buns. Beggars are not allowed on the table in other places. Uncle San does not discriminate against beggars, as long as he pays, he is a guest. There were 5 buns in one drawer. After the beggar finished eating, he raised his head and said, "One more drawer." The third uncle looked at him, waiting for him to pay. Wait a moment, the beggar did not take out the copper coins from his arms this time. He stood up and walked to the street. He stood in the middle of the street, then raised his head and looked at the sky. Tang Ning raised her head in confusion. The sky was as blue, without even a single cloud. Fang Xiaopang also looked towards the sky, blinked curiously, and murmured, "What is there in the sky?" Tang Ning looked for a while but didn't find anything in the sky. He looked away and looked at the beggar again. On the street, many people were attracted by the beggar's behavior and looked up at the sky. "What's in the sky? What are you looking at?" "I don't know, everyone is watching." Just when everyone was looking up at the sky and mumbling to themselves, Tang Ning saw the beggar lower his head, Take out a purse from the arms of a fat man wearing satin clothes, and take out a piece of broken silver. Put the purse back again, and walked over here. On the street. There is nothing in the sky, what are you looking at? You're sick, my neck feels sore just looking at it. I'm so full and have nothing to do. The crowd complained to each other and dispersed unhappy. Tang Ning saw the fat man mutter something, shook his head, and disappeared into the crowd. The beggar walked to the table again, put a piece of broken silver on the table, looked at the third uncle, and said, "These are all changed into steamed buns." As soon as he finished speaking, 2 hands were placed on his left and right shoulders respectively. Before Tang Ning could recover from the beggar's coquettish tactics, she saw Peng Chen and the policeman she had met at the Nei'an County government office last time. Later, Tang Ning heard from her father-in-law that this man's surname was Xiu and his given name was Qing Feng. He was a famous arrestor in Lingzhou and the chief arrestor in Lingzhou. He worked in the governor's yamen. "Is it you again?" The head catcher surnamed Xiu looked at the beggar. "You've only been out for a few days, can't you live in peace?" The beggar swept his sleeves, and the broken silver on the table rolled under the table. He looked at the beggar mother and daughter in the corner, looked at the third uncle again, and said, "Just give them everything." After saying that, he walked straight behind Xiu, the catcher, and let the 2 catchers tie him up with chains. The head catcher surnamed Xiu didn't pay much attention to the scrap of silver. He glanced at Tang Ning and finally looked at Peng Chen. He raised his eyebrows and said, "I asked you to come to my place and double your monthly salary, but you have to shrink from that small yamen." Peng Chen looked at him but said nothing. He took out a few coins, put them on the table, and said, "A drawer of steamed buns. What I say will always count. You should think about it." Xiu Qingfeng glanced at him again, glanced at Tang Ning, and turned to leave. The third uncle made 2 drawers of steamed buns and placed them next to the beggar mother and daughter. He handed them the coins he found, then came back and gave Peng Chen a basket of steamed buns. Tang Ning sat opposite Peng Chen and asked, "Do you know him?" Peng Chen dipped a bun in vinegar and said lightly, "Senior brother." Although Peng Chen is the head catcher of Yong'an County government, compared with his senior brother who is the chief catcher of Lingzhou, he is still a bit unsatisfactory. Tang Ning had heard some rumors about this head hunter. It was said that his name was enough to scare the thieves near Lingzhou. It was also said that his martial arts were unfathomable and he was proficient in 18 kinds of weapons. He looked at Peng Chen and asked, "I heard that he is very powerful in martial arts. He knows all 18 kinds of weapons. Is it true?" Peng Chen ate another bun and nodded. "Oh, it doesn't matter if you are proficient in all 18 kinds of weapons. You can do everything, but you can't do anything well." Tang Ning looked in the direction where the sound came from and saw the old beggar leaning on the corner and walking over with a bun in his hand. He looked at Peng Chen and said, "I want you to lend me some vinegar." He dipped the buns that the mother and daughter gave him in vinegar and put them into his mouth. Peng Chen glanced at him, then at the 2 remaining buns in the cage, and stood up. The old beggar looked at him, pointed at the 2 buns on the table, and asked, "Do you want more?" Peng Chen shook his head, "No more." The old beggar simply sat in his seat, picked up the remaining buns, dipped them in vinegar, and continued, "When it comes to martial arts training, the more moves you know, the more weapons you know, the better. Some people pursue magnificence. Some people pursue a variety of weapons, and some people don't care what moves others use or what weapons they use, just let him use his fists or his legs, swords, guns, swords and halberds, just one sword." When he said this, he stretched out his palm and stroked it casually in the air. His eyes seemed to accidentally glance at Butcher Zheng who was chopping meat in the shop next to him. Butcher Zheng made eye contact with him, and then smiled honestly, continued to chop the meat. Tang Ning was a little surprised. The beggars in Lingzhou city were all really incredible. Some beggars spoke their philosophy of life, and some beggars spoke the true meaning of martial arts. If the old beggar hadn't had bruises on his face from being beaten, he would have almost believed it. Especially when she saw that he was holding a bun, dipping it in vinegar with one hand and picking at his black feet with the other hand. If Tang Ning remembered correctly, he was picking his feet with the hand holding the bun just now. But after careful consideration, what the old beggar said makes some sense. It seems that this is what Dao's Hejian said. Do you think what I said makes sense? Seeing the thoughtful look on Tang Ning's face, the old beggar smiled, took out 3 exquisite books from his arms, and said, I have 3 martial arts secret books here. Sell it to you for money. Tang Ning glanced at him. She bought 3 hardcover erotic albums for 10 taels of silver. Although it was not a loss, it was of no use to him. It was difficult to make a difference in the sea. After seeing a certain kind of art from Japan in later generations, who would treat this as a treasure? Martial arts secrets. Fang Xiaopang's eyes lit up and he ran over quickly and said, I want to see it, I want to see it. The old beggar didn't dodge at all and allowed her hand to reach over. Damn it! Tang Ning's eyelids twitched and she cursed angrily in her heart. She grabbed 3 books from the old beggar's hand, took out a silver coin and put it on the table. She stuffed the 3 secret books into her arms and touched them. Fang Xiaopang turned his head and said, the secrets of martial arts are for adults, not children. Fang Xiaopang was very disappointed. He looked at Tang Ning, thought for a moment, and said, then when I grow up, you must let me see it. Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 94. There is a secret martial arts book that depicts a fight between 2 people. Tang Ning cannot show it to her now or when she grows up. In order to prevent this old bastard from harming the ignorant girl's physical and mental health, Tang Ning bought the 3 martial arts secret books without hesitation. A few days ago, Tang Ning made an appointment with Li Tianlan to talk about game theory. After breakfast, Tang Ning sent Fang Xiaopang back and then returned to Zhong Mansion. Knowledge belongs to all mankind, and this is not a national secret. Back then, he was so excited about learning game theory that he could only wish Miss Li good luck. As soon as he returned to the yard, Tang Yaoyao jumped down from the wall. She looked at Tang Ning and asked, are you familiar with the moves I taught you yesterday? Tang Ning nodded and said, I'm already practiced. Tang Yaoyao stepped forward and said, then I will teach you a few new tricks. No need, Tang Ning said quickly, I still want to practice what I learned earlier a few more times. Tang Yaojiao taught him a few new moves yesterday. His arm still hurt slightly because she hit him when she corrected him. Tang Ning couldn't directly point out that this was naked revenge, but he could find a way to avoid it. Tang Yaoyao looked at him and asked, I'm already familiar with it, what else should I practice? Tang Ning shook her head and said, when it comes to martial arts training, it's not about knowing more moves or knowing more weapons, the better. Some people pursue gorgeous moves, some pursue a variety of weapons, and some people don't care about others. No matter what moves you use, what weapons you use, no matter whether it's a south fist or a north leg, a sword, a gun, a sword, or a halberd, it's just a sword. Tang Ning looked at her and said seriously, so I think it is much better to practice one move 10,000 times than to practice 10,000 moves once. Tang Yaoyao was stunned on the spot, looking at him, and she actually felt that what he said made sense. But if she thought he was right and didn't teach him new moves, what reason would she have to retaliate against him for touching her chest? Where did you get all this nonsense? She glared at Tang Ning, walked over and said, I'll teach you a few more tricks today. Tang Ning shook her head and said hurriedly, no need. Tang Yaoyao pulled his sleeve and said, just 2 moves. It's really unnecessary. Big man, don't be a mother-in-law. Real. Wow. Something fell out of Tang Ning's arms and fell to the ground. Those are the 3 secret books he bought from the old beggar today. Shadowless Sword. Tang Yaoyao picked up a book, opened it, and asked, Where did this thing come from? Don't. When Tang Ning wanted to stop her, Tang Yao Yao had already turned the page. Then her face turned red. She slammed the secret book to the ground, looked at Tang Ning in shame, and cursed angrily, "Shameless thief." She looked at Tang Ning with a look of extreme embarrassment and flew straight over the courtyard wall before disappearing. Tang Ning sighed, bent down and picked up the 3 secret books. Shameless old beggar, the bad guys are innocent. At the door, Li Tianlan knocked on the door, looked at Tang Ning and asked, "Is it convenient for Tang Jiwen now?" "Brother Li is here." Tang Ning nodded and said, "It's convenient." Li Tianlan walked in and seemed to say casually, "What Tang Jiwen just said is very reasonable. In martial arts, if you practice to a high level, you will not be too good at it. However, if you only stay at the superficial level, you still need to dabble in more." Tang Ning looked at her and asked in surprise, "Brother Li also knows martial arts?" Li Tianlan nodded and said, "I understand a little bit." "I know a little bit about it." Tang Ning was a little happy and said, "How about we compete?" He has just learned martial arts, and there are not many people at the same level as him. Among the people he knows, Tang Yao Yao can't be beaten, Peng Chen can't be beaten, Fang Xiaopang, regardless of his weight advantage, Tang Ning should be able to beat him. Now there is an opponent who also understands a little like him. Even though she is a woman, she looks more manly than Su Qingyang and Zhang Yan's Hung. He can temporarily ignore gender and compete with her." Li Tianlan looked at him, unsure. "Let's have a discussion, shall we?" Tang Ning looked around and asked, "Is there anyone else here?" Li Tianlan thought for a while, nodded and said, "Okay." Tang Ning put the secret books aside and said, "Brother Li, let's make the first move. There's no need to hold anything back." Although it was a sparring match, she was a woman, so she could make the first move. Li Tianlan looked at him and asked, "Is Tang Jiwen ready?" Tang Ning nodded, "Ready." As soon as he finished speaking, a shadow passed before his eyes. Li Tianlan curled his fingers into a sword and pointed it at his throat. The throat is one of the most vulnerable parts of the human body. Even an ordinary person can be killed by attacking the throat. A martial arts practitioner can easily pierce a person's throat with 2 fingers. No more competition, martial arts training is boring. Tang Ning was stunned for a long time, then took a step back, picked up the 3 secret books again, waved her hand, and walked towards her room. As for a little understanding, Tang Yeyun is no more than that, and women are all big liars. Game theory was an elective course for Tang Ning during her college years. This course has a wide range of applications. They only learn the basics in class. Tang Ning herself was confused. At that time, she only remembered classic examples such as Prisoner's Dilemma, Wise Pig Game and 3 Princesses Dividing Gold. I don't know if Miss Li can understand it with her IQ. But no matter what, it should be much better than Ching-er who can only understand Grimm's fairy tales. To understand game theory, you need to have a certain mathematical foundation. Tang Ning clearly felt that Li Tianlan was a little confused. But he was only responsible for explaining. Since he promised him, he would teach her the relevant knowledge he knew seriously and responsibly. As for whether she could understand it, it was not within the scope of their agreement. Tang Ning threw all the theories to her. Feeling a little hungry, she decided to go to the kitchen to find something to eat. She stood up and said, "Brother Li, please sit here for a while. I'll leave you for a while." Li Tianlan was full of what he just said and nodded in a daze. The unprecedented things that flooded into her mind in a short period of time gave her a headache. She opened the window and a cool breeze blew in, which made her feel much more comfortable. The breeze floated her hair and also blew the martial arts secret book that Tang Ning had placed on the table. Li Tianlan glanced at it inadvertently, and after a moment of stunned, his face began to turn red. When Tang Ning came back with a steamed bun, the room was empty. "Brother Li." He looked around the room and walked to the yard, wondering, how can this person just leave without saying anything? He has no manners at all. He returned to the room and flipped through them casually. Although the contents of these secret books were wonderful, the red lines on the body greatly affected the beauty, and there was no textual explanation. He shook his head, hid these secret books, and began to read. Although he said that practicing martial arts was boring, he still had to practice, and he had to consciously strengthen his strength and endurance training. Peng Chen had the habit of running and patrolling the state capital in the morning, so he might as well start from tomorrow and follow him in the morning. Although Tang Ning was not used to getting up so early, he had to endure some hardship in order to avoid being bullied by women in the future. In the early morning, even the breakfast shops in the city were not open. Two figures appeared from the mist and disappeared in the mist. At the same time, in the capital, on the Golden Palace. In the past, if there was nothing important, the morning court was just a routine matter and would be dismissed in half an hour at most. But today, the morning court had lasted for an hour. Zhang Hao, a doctor of the Ministry of Water Resources, took a step forward with his tablet in his arms and said loudly, "I think that when selecting officials based on policy essays, we select learned people who know how to govern the country, not pedants who only know how to write articles. Your Majesty, articles cannot govern the country. Mr. Zhang is wrong. Who in this world is born with knowledge?" Wang Shuo looked at him and said, "The court has always considered officials comprehensively. If you don't even know the rules of writing articles, how can you be considered a learned person?" At this time, Wang Shuo was in the court, and the Ministry of Rights was behind him. Although the power controlled by the Ministry of Rights was not as good as that of the Ministry of Personnel and the Ministry of Revenue, it was the nominal head of the 6 ministries and had a huge influence in the court. The two people from the Ministry of Works and the Ministry of Rights argued with each other in the court. Apart from that, not many people spoke. The reform of the imperial examination system was mentioned almost every once in a while in the court, but it only caused a few waves. The way of the imperial examination was related to the fate of students all over the world and the stability of the country, and it was not so easy to change. Fang Hong stood in the crowd, looked at the two people arguing in front of him, and shook his head helplessly. Wang Shuo seized on the grammatical errors in the test paper, which really caused a lot of trouble for Zhang Hao. He still couldn't figure it out. Tang Ning's talent was unquestionable, but his writing was, how could it be so bad? Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 95. Today's court is clearly divided into 3 factions. The Reform faction headed by the Ministry of Industry, the Conservative faction headed by the Ministry of Rights, and the bystanders who did not participate in the opinions. Neither of the 2 ministers spoke, and those who argued in court were all officials below the 4th rank. The courtiers looked at Zhang Hao, the impassioned water doctor in front of them, and shook their heads secretly. Although Zhang Hao's words were reasonable, he had to be extra careful every step he took to reform the imperial examination system. If the reform was so easy, the imperial examination system would have been reorganized countless times in recent years. "Send me the test papers of the candidate you mentioned." A deep voice finally came from the top of the Golden Palace. His Majesty opened his mouth, and Zhang Hao and Wang Shuo immediately closed their mouths. A eunuch came down, holding a few test papers, and walked up respectfully, standing next to the man in imperial robes. Chen Huang casually picked up the top exam paper. After looking at it carefully, a look of surprise appeared on his face and he murmured, "If I remember correctly, the last time someone answered 100% of the questions correctly was more than 10 years ago, right?" A rich-looking eunuch beside him nodded and said with a smile, "Your Majesty, that happened 15 years ago." Chen Huang nodded and said, "It is not easy to answer all the questions in this test, and it is even more difficult to answer them all correctly. This candidate's daily diligence must be different from ordinary people." He put down the test paper and picked up another one. This time he looked at it for a long time, a strange light flashed in his eyes, and praised, "Good, good, good." The officials in the palace couldn't help but be surprised when they saw the emperor say good 3 times in succession. At this time, Chen Huang had continued to speak. "Don't be afraid of your bones being shattered into pieces, you must leave your innocence in the world." Emperor Chen glanced down and said, "This poem can be used as a personal admonishment for the courtiers in the palace." He couldn't wait to look at the next page, and this time, he looked at it longer. The expression on his face changed from anticipation to shock to confusion, then he put it aside and murmured, "This poem is, well, not bad." The last thing he looked at was the strategy section. This time, Chen Huang didn't look for long before he looked down and said in a deep voice, "Fang Hong, Wangbo, this is what you selected, Lingzhou Prefecture Trial Jiwen." Seeing that the situation was not good, Wangbo was startled, and immediately walked out with the Wutban in his arms and said, "Your Majesty, I asked you to be the chief examiner of the Lingzhou prefectural examination. Is this how you select candidates for me?" Chen Huang rolled up the examination papers, threw them to the ground, stood up, and asked, "Tell me, what is written on this?" Seeing this, Wang Shuo glanced at Fang Hong and Wangbo, with a hint of joy on his face. Fang Hong stood up and explained hurriedly, "Your Majesty, this test paper." "This test paper is nonsense," Chen Huang interrupted him, glanced down, and said, "Where is the Lingzhou prefectural examination, where is the Lingzhou prefecture examination, and where is the association examination?" Above the court, there were more than a dozen people whose expressions changed, and they could only stand up bravely. Song Qian was not in Beijing as a prisoner on Jingdong Road. Only Zhang Hao and Ling Yuheng were present at the palace today. Chen Huang looked down and said in a deep voice, "You will know your guilt if you wait." Plop. As soon as these words came out, several officials who stood up immediately fell to their knees. Emperor Chen looked at them and angrily said, "I have given you the important task of selecting candidates for the country, and you are so perfunctory with me. Tell me, what kind of bullshit article is this about the dignified Yazhu Jiwen?" All the officials felt the emperor's anger, lowered their heads, held their breath, and secretly mourned for the examiners going to Lingzhou. Wang Shuo secretly rejoiced. He took a step forward and said respectfully, "Your Majesty, I tried my best to dissuade the adults at that time. It's a pity that the adults insisted that this volume is advisable. I failed to dissuade these adults. I am guilty." Chen Huang glanced down with some disappointment and said, "Fang Hong and Wangbo, as the chief examiner, neglected their duties and were fined for 1 year. The other associate examiners were also fined for half a year to set an example." When all the officials heard this, they already understood in their hearts that His Majesty still did not want to punish them severely. A 1-year fine was not serious, and the charges against them were only neglect of duty, not malpractice for personal gain. This was already a great deal of preferential treatment for them. After Chen Huang finished speaking, the anger on his face did not subside. He looked at the examination paper on the ground and said angrily, "As for this paper, it is determined to be Jiwen, which is really ridiculous." At this time, Zhang Hao looked sad and angry, and said loudly, "Your Majesty, it is a small thing to fine me, but it is a big thing to save the treasury." Emperor Chen was about to personally judge the volume as a failure. He frowned and asked, "What does this have to do with the treasury?" Zhang Hao hugged the whiteboard and said loudly, "Because this test paper can not only control floods and ensure smooth water transportation, but also save the national treasury at least 500,000 taels of silver every year." As soon as these words came out, among the hundreds of officials, one official, who was holding a whiteboard and taking a nap with his eyes closed, opened his eyes suddenly, his eyes shining brightly. A person next to him turned to look at him and asked, "Master Qian, what's wrong?" Qianshuo, the Minister of Household Affairs, did not answer him and looked directly at Zhang Hao in front of him. Because of water control and water transportation, the state treasury allocates a huge sum of money to the Ministry of Industry every year. Every time he thinks about it, his heart bleeds. If the Ministry of Industry can ask less than 500,000 taels of silver from the Ministry of Revenue every year, how much less pressure will the Ministry of Revenue have? Chen Huang was stunned for a moment, thought for a moment, looked at Zhang Hao and asked, "What did Zhang Yiking just say?" Zhang Hao stood up and said, "Your Majesty, Tang Jiwen's policy on water control in the third state examination was discussed by the Ministry of Water Resources and was found to be feasible. It can save at least 500,000 taels of silver for the national treasury every year. At the same time, it can also speed up the canal transportation and ensure the smooth flow of canal transportation for at least 10 years. Emperor Chen thought for a moment, then bowed and picked up the test paper that he had thrown on the ground. He looked at the test paper, then looked at Zhang Hao and asked, "Are you serious, Mr. Zhang?" Zhang Hao stood up straight and said, "I guarantee it with my life." Ling Yuheng also walked out and said, "Your Majesty, Tang Jiwen's policy on epidemic prevention can also be used as a standard and promoted by the court to local areas. Once an epidemic occurs in a certain place, it can minimize casualties and impacts." Emperor Chen looked at the test paper again, thinking. At this time, Qianshuo, the Minister of Revenue, stood up and said, "Your Majesty, although Lord Fang, Lord Wang, and the other examiners have made mistakes, they are all for the sake of the court and your Majesty. They can save so much for the national treasury, and their merits can offset their mistakes. The Ministry of Revenue is in charge of the country's money and grain, and its position is very important among the 6 ministries. The words of the Minister of Revenue are naturally very important. All officials know that the national treasury has been tight for a long time, and it has always been a concern for your Majesty. Now that the Ministry of Works has saved hundreds of thousands of taels of silver for the national treasury, your Majesty is naturally happy, but he has just punished those examiners. The king is not joking, so naturally he can't take it back easily." Qian Shangshu's words gave His Majesty a way out. Emperor Chen looked at the Minister of Revenue with satisfaction and said, "Qian Yiking's words make sense. Fang and Wang Yiking have made meritorious contributions to the policy. They will be rewarded with 1,000 taels of silver and 300 pieces of silk. The rest of you who participated in the examination will be rewarded with 100 pieces of silk each. The imperial edict of salary deduction has been issued and cannot be taken back, but these rewards have made up for the salary deduction, and there is still more." After Emperor Chen finished the reward, he did not mention the examination papers again. He thought for a moment, looked down, and said, "For the policy essay, we still need to pay attention to the article, but in addition, we should also make appropriate considerations. The Ministry of Rights will discuss this matter first." The word consider is very spiritual. The officials have been immersed in the officialdom for many years, so how could they not understand it? Your Majesty issued a hidden imperial edict for this examination paper alone. Wang Shuo's face turned pale and he looked in a certain direction, which was the position of the Minister of Rights. A middle-aged man glanced at him indifferently, and Wang Shuo understood, lowered his head, and said nothing more. After a moment, Emperor Chen looked down and said, "If there is nothing else, let's leave the court." Today's morning court lasted for a long time, and the process was full of twists and turns. The Lingzhou provincial examination examiners, including Fang Hong, the assistant minister of the Ministry of Personnel, were punished by His Majesty first and then rewarded. Although the Ministry of Works' imperial examination reform plan was still not adopted, His Majesty's secret order to the Ministry of Shangshu still showed that the Ministry of Works was better in this confrontation between the Ministry of Rights and the Ministry of Rights. Being able to use a provincial examination paper to stir up such a big wave in the court, the officials also had a first impression of Tang Jiwen from Lingzhou. "Lord Fang," Stay. When Fang Hong was about to walk out of the palace gate, a voice suddenly came from behind him. Fang Hong turned around and saw the Minister of Rights coming over, and asked in confusion, "What's the matter, Lord Tang? You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 96. Minister of Rights Tang Huai looked at Fang Hong and said with a smile, "Lingzhou is a long way away, Lord Fang has worked hard on this trip." "It's my duty, it's not hard," Fang Hong replied, with a flash of suspicion in his eyes. He and Minister of Rights Tang Huai had no intersection in peacetime, and Fang's actions seemed a bit excessive. Tang Huai looked at him, shook his head and said, "The reform of the imperial examination system is a risky move. Lord Fang is still a bit impatient." Just now in the court, although the Ministry of Works and the Ministry of Rights were arguing with each other, Fang Hong, the Assistant Minister of the Ministry of Personnel, stood on the side of the Ministry of Works. Fang Hong nodded and said, "Lord Tang is right." Tang Huai looked at him and said, "However, this Lingzhou Tang Jiwen is a rare talent who can save hundreds of thousands of taels of silver for the national treasury every year. I am looking forward to his performance in the provincial examination." The provincial examination was held in the capital and was under the full responsibility of the Ministry of Rights. Fang Hong thought about it, looked at the Minister of Rights Tang Huai, and smiled. Lord Tang just needs to wait a few more months. The two walked out of the palace together, and Tang Huai asked casually, "What happened just now?" I heard Dr. Zhang mention that Tang Jiwen has not yet come of age. Even if he has achieved such an achievement at the age of coming of age, it is rare. He is so young, but it is difficult for ordinary candidates to reach his goal in their lifetime. I wonder which state he is from. Lingzhou Gongyuan accommodates candidates from 3 states. Fang Hong felt that Tang Huai's words had some deeper meaning, but he didn't think much about it. He said, "Tang Jiwen is a local student in Lingzhou." Tang Huai nodded, as if he was just asking casually. He exchanged a few words with Fang Hong and then separated. Wang Shuo followed from behind and walked to Tang Huai. He said palely, "Lord Tang, I am incompetent, so let the Ministry of Works." Tang Huai waved his hand, interrupted him, and asked, "What do you know about Lingzhou Jiwen?" Wang Shuo was slightly stunned. The Minister of Rights and the Ministry of Works debated in the court this time, and he never asked a single question. Why did he ask about Tang Jiwen after the morning court? He was stunned for a moment, then immediately said, "This man is called Tang Ning, under 18 years old, from Yong'an County, Lingzhou. He is married to the daughter of the magistrate of Yong'an County." Already married, Tang Huai narrowed his eyes and asked, "When did you get married?" Wang Shuo shook his head, I don't know." Tang Huai rubbed his thumb and index finger slightly, and murmured, "Tang Ning, Lingzhou, Yong'an County, under 18 years old." Wang Shuo watched the Shangshu Lord walk away, and a trace of doubt emerged in his heart again. It seems that the Shangshu Lord seems to have a talent for Tang Jiwen. He regretted that he should not have quarreled with Zhang Hao when he was reading the papers. Tang Huai walked out of the palace gate for dozens of steps, and an old servant in grey came from a distance and followed him quietly. Tang Huai paused and was silent for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was slightly cold. "Didn't they say he was dead?" The old man raised his head, a look of shock appeared on his face, and he murmured, "Impossible, they have clearly confirmed." "That's what you told me 17 years ago. That's what you told me 4 months ago." Tang Huai looked at him coldly and said indifferently, "This is the last time." The old man opened his mouth, and after a moment, he whispered, "Yes. The capital, Tang Mansion. There are many people with the surname Tang in the capital, but when it comes to Tang Mansion, the people will only think of one. The three brothers in this Tang mansion are all pillars of the court. The current owner of the Tang mansion is Tang Hui, the Minister of Revenue. In addition, there are two legitimate daughters of the Tang mansion. One is a favorite concubine in the palace. The prince born by her is deeply loved by the emperor and is one of the three adult princes left by his majesty. In a quiet courtyard in the Tang mansion, a pretty girl was swinging leisurely in the courtyard. Seeing the middle-aged man walking into the courtyard, she jumped off the swing and said in surprise, "Dad, why are you back so early today?" The middle-aged man looked at her and asked, "Is your aunt at home?" "Dad, are you okay?" The girl looked at him more puzzled and asked, "When did your aunt leave home?" The middle-aged man nodded, walked out of the door again, walked through the Tang mansion for a while, and came to a more quiet courtyard. He knocked on the door and then pushed it open. There was a pavilion in the courtyard, and a woman was sitting in the pavilion. The woman had a beautiful face and gorgeous clothes. She was sitting in the pavilion, carefully sewing a piece of clothing. Qin Jing walked into the pavilion, and when he walked in front of the woman did not look up at him. Qin Jing was silent for a moment, and said, "Xiao Yu." The woman seemed not to hear his voice, lowered her head, and continued to sew. "He's still alive." Qin Jing breathed a sigh of relief and said, "It's been 17 years. Thank God, he's still alive." The woman paused, the sewing needle pierced her finger, and blood oozed out. Outside the courtyard, the girl pressed her ear against the crack of the door and asked in confusion, "Who is he?" In Lingzhou, Tang Ning didn't know the treacherous situation in the capital. He used the game theory problem of pirates dividing gold to stump Li Tianlan. She hadn't come to see him for 2 days. In this regard, Li Tianlan couldn't compare with Tang Yaoyao. When encountering a problem that she didn't understand, Tang Yaoyao could say, "I don't understand, I can't, tell me," but Li Tianlan had to solve the problem. What a strong woman! Tang Ning sighed, carried Fang Xiaopang on her back, walked down the street, and continued walking towards the Zhong mansion. "I originally ran with Peng Chen in the morning to keep fit, but after Fang Xiaopang heard about it, he insisted on running with him. He said he wanted to lose weight. But halfway through, he couldn't run anymore. He lay on the ground tired and still he asked Tang Ning to carry her back. Tang Ning felt that he was doing it all on his own. Carrying such a drag bottle was much more tiring than running, so he could only treat it as weight-bearing strength training. Fang Xiaopang didn't work very hard when running, but he tried his best when eating. Her appetite alone is comparable to that of Tang Ning's Hong Gai and Tang Yaoyao. Fang Hong should really be allowed to put some living expenses at Zhong's house every month. At least 100 taels. Tang Ning stopped her from serving the third bowl of rice. Fang Xiaopang looked at him pitifully. Tang Ning frowned and said, "Didn't you say you want to become thinner and more beautiful?" Fang Xiaopang looked at him, thought for a moment, and said, "But only when you are full can you have the strength to run and become thinner and more beautiful." Fang Xiaopang is hopeless. He will never become thinner or more beautiful in this life. Tang Ning waved her hand and said, "Go ahead, I can only eat one more bowl." The penultimate bowl. Bowl. 2 bowls. The two haggled for a while and finally settled for a bowl and a half. Today's food was very rich. She ate a lot of food. After the third bowl of rice, she couldn't eat any more. She walked around in the yard. She planned to walk for a while to relieve her appetite and then finish the remaining half bowl. There was still the last piece of 1000 cake left on the plate, so Tang Ning stretched out her chopsticks to pick it up. But someone got the better of him. Zhong Yi held the piece of milfeuille cake, looked at Tang Ning's extended chopsticks, put it down, and said, "You can eat it?" Tang Ning shook her head and said, "You can eat it?" Zhong Yi smiled, "You better eat it." "I'm full, you can eat." Tang Yaoyao stretched out her chopsticks, picked up the piece of milfeuille cake, put it in her bowl, looked at them, and said, "If you don't want to eat it, then I'll eat it. Fang Xiaopang ran back from the yard, took out a paper bag from his treasure bag, opened it, put it on the table, and said, I also have a piece of 1,000-layer cake here, you can eat it. Tang Ning looked at Zhongyi and said, half for each person. Zhongyi thought for a while and nodded. Tang Ning divided the 1,000-layer cake into 2 halves and took half of it herself. When Zhongyi picked up the chopsticks, she accidentally touched the chopsticks to the ground. She looked at Tang Ning and said helplessly, you better eat it. Tang Ning picked up the half piece of millefeuille cake, looked at her, and said, open your mouth. Zhongyi looked at him blankly. Tang Ning looked at her and said, what are you doing standing there? Open your mouth and I'll feed you. Zhongyi's face turned slightly red, but when she saw Tang Ning looking at her, she obediently opened her mouth. Tang Yaoyao watched Tang Ning feed the half piece of 1,000-feuille cake to Zhongyi. Zhongyi looked ashamed and then looked at the whole piece of 1,000-feuille cake in his bowl. At this moment, she truly felt that Xiaoyi, who had been as close to her as a sister since childhood, was finally different from her in some way. This made her a little sad and she even lost her appetite. She put down her chopsticks and said gloomily, I'm full. Tang Ning looked at the remaining food in her bowl, then looked at her again, and said, if you don't want to eat it, don't put so much in it. It's such a waste. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 97. P.S. The last name was written incorrectly. Tang Jing is not Qin Jing. He is getting older and his memory is getting worse. Miss Tang was born with a silver spoon in her mouth. From the moment she was born, she was the richest girl in Lingzhou City. She could earn 100 taels of silver just by reciting a poem. Naturally, she didn't know what frugality meant. Xiao Ru and third uncle have always lived a hard life, and they have never been as wasteful as her. When the breakfast shop first opened, they couldn't sell out all the tofu now. My third uncle ate it all by himself until he vomited, but he didn't waste a single bowl. Xiru's cloth shop has opened. It is called a cloth shop, but in fact it sells more accessories, fabrics, and the like. It is small and meticulous and is very popular among women. The business is very good every day. Whether it's Uncle San's breakfast shop or Xiao Ru's cloth shop, Tang Ning doesn't think about making money. Only when they have something to do can they feel at ease. When he was about to reach the shop, he saw the beggars squatting in the corner, each holding a few buns in their hands. Judging from the size of the bun, it should have been given to them by their third uncle. Tang Ning was a little confused. Third uncle had always recognized money but not people. Apart from the beggar mother and daughter, he had never given alms to other beggars. Sir, several beggars saw him coming and immediately stood up to greet him. Tang Ning noticed that they looked a little embarrassed. Although they were all beggars and were a bit slovenly, there was no reason why they all had bruises on their noses and faces. There was a group of beggars causing trouble in front of Xiru's shop just now. The customers were so scared that they didn't dare to go in. The third uncle looked at Tang Ning, pointed at the beggars, and said, thanks to their help. Making trouble, Tang Ning looked at her third uncle and asked, is Xiru okay? Why are they causing trouble? Xiao Ru is in the shop. She's fine. The third uncle shook his head and said, I don't know why they went crazy. They were sitting at the door of the shop, so scared that the guests didn't dare to go in. A beggar stood up, put a bun in his arms, looked at Tang Ning, and said, Sir, those guys are from another street. They must have been ordered by others to collect money to do things, and deliberately came to cause trouble. Tang Ning looked at him and asked, the beggar on the other street? The beggar nodded and said, this is not the first time they have done this kind of thing. The state has national laws, the family has family rules, and a beggar must also follow the rules of being a beggar. The beggars' gang is known as the most upright gang in the world. The gang rules are strict, including the 8 essentials and 10 commandments. They have always behaved decently. How could they be so bad? Act. Tang Ning looked at the beggar and asked, "Don't you beggars care if they do this?" "Beggars gang," the beggar looked at him doubtfully and asked, "What beggars gang?" Tang Ning looked at him and asked doubtfully, "Have you never heard of the beggar clan?" The beggar shook his head and said, "I've never heard of it." "Really not?" "No." "Third uncle, please have 2 bowls of tofu now." Tang Ning thought for a moment, greeted her third uncle, then looked at the beggar, pointed to a stool, and said, "Sit down, let's talk." "No, no, no, sir, my body is dirty." "Sitting down will make the stool dirty. Just stand and listen to what you say." The beggar waved his hands repeatedly and stood beside Tang Ning in a panic. Tang Ning waved her hand and said, "Sit down if I ask you to. I have to raise my head to talk to you while you are standing. I'm tired." When the beggar heard this, he hesitated for a moment, then walked over to sit opposite Tang Ning, but he only dared to touch the stool with half of his buttocks. Tang Ning thought for a while, looked at him and asked, "Your name is Lu Lao?" When he was chatting with these beggars before, he asked his name. Among the beggars on this street, Lu Lao was still somewhat famous. He was the leader of the several beggars in this alley. The beggar said quickly, "Young master has a good memory, so I will call you Lu Lao Er." Tang Ning nodded and continued to ask, "What happened to the beggar on the other street you just mentioned?" Lu Lao explained, "Back to the young master, those guys from Jinmeizi on the next street are just a bunch of scum. They cheat, kidnap, and steal, and they do whatever they can. The girl's shop opened here. She must have disturbed someone, so she let her go. Jinmeizi and the others came to cause trouble. The so-called colleagues are enemies. The opening of a new store in Zairu, and the business is booming, will naturally attract the jealousy of many people." Tang Ning is not surprised by this, so she asked Lu Lao and the others to help keep an eye on it. Unexpectedly, it has only been a few days. Some people can't help it. "Don't worry about settling these accounts yet." Tang Ning looked at Lu Lao and asked, "How do you beggars in Lingzhou calculate your power? Please tell me in detail." When Tang Ning first started looking for the little beggar, she had learned about the general situation of the beggars here. Scholars have their own circle of scholars, businessmen have their own circle of businessmen, officials have their own circle of officials, and beggars naturally have their own circle of beggars. Every street in Lingzhou City, which can even be subdivided into the first half and the second half of each street, belongs to different spheres of influence. Almost every beggar in the city has a fixed begging place, which is like a territory. If you invade other people's territory, the other party will fight tooth and nail. So it's not that easy to be a beggar these days. It is human instinct to hug together. Beggars in an area will form small groups. 7 or 8 people like Lu Lao occupy an alley or half a street. Jinmei's younger brother in the next street has more, about a dozen personal appearance. There is no beggar clan, and naturally there is no Lingzhou branch of the beggar clan. There are only small forces like Lu Lao. A beggar who doesn't want to be a gang leader is not a good beggar. A beggar must be enterprising. Just guarding this alley will lead to nothing in life. There are many beggars in Lingzhou City, and there are even more beggars in the world. Although the world's largest gang, the Beggars' Gang, is only a fiction in the novel, if all the beggars in the world can be gathered together, it will also be a very powerful force. Tang Ning looked at Lu Lao and asked, "Have you been displeased with Jinmei's for a long time?" Lu Lao was stunned for a moment, then nodded and gritted his teeth and said, "Half of the street next door was originally ours, but it was later taken away by Jinmei's. Many brothers suffered a lot at his hands." Tang Ning thought about it, looked at him and asked, "Do you want to take revenge and take back your territory?" Lu Lao hesitated for a moment, looked at him, and said awkwardly, "They have more people, we can't beat them." Tang Ning pointed at Peng Chen who was sitting on the side eating buns, looked at Lu Lao and asked, "Do you know who he is?" "Lingzhou City," At a street corner, more than a dozen beggars gathered here. A beggar handed a whole chicken wrapped in lotus leaves to a pockmarked beggar in the front, flattering, "Brother, this is the chicken you wanted." Jinmeiza tore off 2 chicken legs, handed the rest back, and said, "These brothers share it?" The beggars showed joy on their faces and hurriedly said, "Thank you, brother." A beggar next to Jinmeiza gnawed the chicken butt and muttered, "Brother, it's all Lu Lao's blind gang. If they hadn't ruined our business, that person would have given more money." Another beggar interrupted, "Lu Lao and his gang are meddling in other people's business. Sooner or later, we will have to deal with them." Jinmeiza took a big bite of the chicken leg and accidentally pulled a bruise on his face, and his face twitched. This bruise was left by Lu Lao's punch today. They had an old grudge with Lu Lao and his gang, and today's incident added new hatred to the old hatred. A beggar ran over from the street in a panic and said, "Brother, Lu Lao sent someone to tell us that he wants to fight with us this afternoon on Changping Street." Beggars in Lingzhou City often fight to compete for territory. The loser either gives up the territory and gets out of Lingzhou City, or submits to the winner. Jinmeiza didn't expect that before they had troubled Lu Lao, the other party came to them. Jinmeiza narrowed his eyes and said, "What time?" The beggar said, "Sushi." "Let them wait." Jinmeiza stood up and said, "This time, we will settle old and new accounts together." Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 98. Today there will be no excitement until Su Tangning and Lu Lao chatted for a while and then walked into Xiao Ru's shop. There are many customers in the store, most of them women, gathering in 2s and 3s in front of the shelves, talking about the goods on the shelves. Many goods in the store are very popular, but the most popular is a round fan. This round fan is different from ordinary round fans. In addition to landscape figures, flowers, birds, fish, and insects, a poem is also embroidered on it. These poems were written by Miss Zhong Yi, the most talented woman in Lingzhou. They are all new poems that no one has ever seen before. Naturally, Zhong Yi's fans in Lingzhou City have their hands full. What's more, every one of them has "You won't miss any of them," and you will be able to collect all your favorite works. However, the best-selling song in the shop is the song "You and Me," which is "On my brows but in my heart." Almost every time a new batch of goods arrives, they are sold out as soon as they are put on the shelves. Miss Zhong has countless fans in Lingzhou, and she is responsible for more than half of the business in the shop. Of course, the two sisters have a deep love for each other, and no one cares about it. Speaking of the deep love between sisters, the two of them had different backgrounds, different interests, and quite different personalities, yet they could stick together every day and seemed to have endless topics to talk about. This made Tangning a little confused. He looked at Xiao Ru, thought for a moment, and asked, "Did Xiao Yi say something to you?" Su Ru was startled when he heard this, then his face turned crimson, and he lowered his head and looked at his toes. It seemed that Zhong Yi had indeed said something to her. With such a lady, it seems that God brought him into this world inexplicably, and there is no compensation. Tang Ning looked at her and comforted her, "Don't worry, I'm the top pick. I will definitely pass the exam." Su Ru nodded, but her face turned redder. She is probably the one who has a pretty face and a blushing face. Zhong Yi is very cute even when she is shy. Tang Yejing is much thicker-skinned and has never known what shyness is. Seeing Tang Ning looking at her, Su Ru lowered her head and whispered, "Brother Xiaoning, is there something on my face?" Tang Ning nodded, "Yes, a little bit." Su Ru raised her head, slightly panicked, touched her face and asked, "What's there?" Tang Ning pinched her face and said with a smile, "It's kind of pretty." Su Ru was stunned for a moment, then her face turned red and she quickly ran to the backyard. Tang Yao Yao stood at the door, staring at the scene in a daze. She didn't want to see Xiao Yi and that guy being in love with each other, and wanted to come over and ask Xiao are you how to embroider Mandarin ducks. After she learned how to embroider the Mandarin ducks, the guy wouldn't laugh at her for not being like a woman. Then she saw the scene just now. It turns out that she is not only different from Xiao Yi, but also different from Xiao are you. Bah, she glared at Tang Ning and said, shameless. Tang Yuyao is jealous, nakedly jealous, because no one usually praises her for her good looks. Others like talented women, not female villains. Zhong Yi would come to the shop when she had nothing to do. As long as she left the Zhong mansion, there would be a group of fangirls around her. They would gather in the shop and buy something. According to Tang Ning's calculations, it would take a few days for Li Tianlan to figure out the game theory problems. Before that, he probably wouldn't come to him, so he simply read in the room behind the shop. After Zhong Yi spent this time, although his training and strategies cannot be said to be full of flowers, they are at least somewhat promising. When it was almost midnight, Tang Ning put down her book and walked to another adjacent street. Changping Street, somewhere in a dark alley. A group of beggars entered the dark alley aggressively, led by the beggar leader on this street, Jin Meizi. Behind him, there were more than 10 beggars, each holding a thick wooden stick in his hand and looking fierce. A beggar walked into the alley and said loudly, Lu Lao, come out quickly, it's already time, do you want to be a coward? As soon as he finished speaking, several figures walked out from the corner at the end of the alley. The leader was none other than Lu Lao. Jin Meizi and others were overjoyed when they saw that there were only a few people around Lu Lao. They thought that Lu Lao took the initiative to ask for a fight this time because he had some ambush or was sure of victory. But now it seems that they were completely careless. Jin Meizi looked at the figures at the end of the alley, waved to the people behind him, and said, hit them until they are convinced. More than a dozen beggars came forward slowly, holding thick wooden sticks in their hands. Wait a minute, Lu Lao suddenly stretched out his hand and said loudly. Jin Meizi frowned, looked at Lu Lao, and asked, what else do you have to say? Lu Lao looked at them and asked loudly, are you going up one by one, or together? Jin Meizi looked at him as if he were a fool. Their number was more than twice that of Lu Lao. They only took advantage if they worked together. Who would be stupid enough to fight alone? He was too lazy to talk to Lu Lao, waved his hand, and said again, what are you still doing in a daze? Let's come together. Wait a minute, Lu Lao stretched out his hand again. Jin Meizi said impatiently, what else do you have to do? Lu Lao looked behind Jin Meizi, bowed and said, sir, please report, Jin Meizi and others are fighting in the street. Wow! An iron chain was put around Jin Meizi's neck. The other beggars were shocked and turned their heads one after another to see a policeman holding the other end of the chain, and they were surrounded by more than 10 officials. The iron chain on his neck felt a little cold. Jin Meizi looked at Lu Lao, then at the constable at the alley entrance. His expression contained confusion, shock, astonishment, and disbelief. He was a little stunned for a while. You are so brave to fight in the street, a constable glanced at them and said, take them all away. The beggars behind Jin Meizi were also put on iron chains. A beggar pointed at Lu Lao and others and said angrily, why don't you arrest them? Lu Lao spread his hands, empty-handed, and said, we didn't take anything. Do you have evidence that we are fighting? Jin Meizi looked at Lu Lao, then at the constable at the alley entrance, and was stunned in place, as if struck by lightning. Now, even a fool can see that Lu Lao and these officials are in the same group. Today's fight is a trap for them. However, Lu Lao and his people are just beggars of low status. When did they get involved with the officials? Jin Meizi was dragged away by the iron chain before he had time to think about this problem. Lu Lao stood at the entrance of the alley, waved to them, and shouted, take care. When Tang Ning came, Peng Chen and his team had finished their fishing enforcement, and Lu Lao and his team were also anxious to regain the territory of another street. In the beggar circle, the result of the fight determines the ownership of the territory. This time Lu Lao and his team took over Jin Meizi's place, and other beggars will surrender to them tomorrow. When Jin Meizi and his team were released from the prison, there were only two ways in front of them. Either surrender to Lu Lao or find a new territory. In detail, they actually only have one way, because as long as they are still in Lingzhou City, they will definitely be found by Lu Lao and his team again. As the only nine-bag guardian elder of the beggar gang so far, it is his responsibility to strengthen the beggar gang, and his most important task at the moment is to integrate all the beggars in Lingzhou and establish the first branch of the beggar gang, the Lingzhou branch. Winning people's hearts is a money-burning job. Tang Ning still had a lot of silver left, so he gave some to Lu Lao as the start-up capital for establishing the beggars section in the short term. His goal was the provincial exam, and these start-up funds were enough for them to use until the provincial exam was over. Zhou Yi found that the table in his room was a little shaky last night, so someone sent a new table today. The few tattered books that Tang Ning found from the old beggar were no longer useful as pads for the corners of the table. He took it in his hand and flipped through it casually. Tang Yao Yao stood at the door, looked at him, and asked, "What are you reading?" "Martial arts secret book," Tang Ning replied casually. Speaking of martial arts secret book, some images emerged in Tang Yao Yao's mind. She glared at him and spat, "Shameless." "It's not what you think." Tang Ning walked over and showed her the tattered book in his hand. "Bah, I won't read it, stay away from me." Tang Yao Yao covered her face with her hands, and her eyes appeared through her fingers. "Huh." She suddenly took her hand away and snatched the book from Tang Ning. After taking a closer look, a strange light appeared on her face. She looked at him and asked, "Where did you get this?" Tang Yajing's eyes looked a little strange. Tang Ning looked at the tattered book in his hand, then looked at her and said, "I bought it." Tang Yao Yao asked again, "Why didn't I see you take it out before?" "I used it to pad the corners of the table before," Tang Ning explained. Tang Yao Yao looked at him, took a deep breath, and asked, "Are you a pig?" You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 99. I'm not. If someone else asked him, "Are you a pig?" Tang Ning would definitely fight back, but he couldn't fight back against Tang Yajing, and he couldn't beat her either. Let's put this down for later. He looked at Tang Yao Yao, unwilling to dwell on whether he was a pig or not, and pointed at the tattered books and asked, "Don't tell me, what secrets are these really?" Tang Yao Yao pointed at one of the pages and asked, "Have you read this?" Tang Ning shook his head and nodded. He just flipped through the books symbolically, without deliberately memorizing them. Tang Yao Yao looked at him and asked, "Do you feel that this move is familiar?" Tang Ning looked over and felt that it was a little familiar. Then he looked at Tang Yao Yao's chest. Tang Yajing is indeed Tang Yajing. Although she is not well educated, her knowledge in this area is much better than his. He is the type who has a mountain of treasures but doesn't know it, and has eyes but doesn't know the secrets. Tang Ning seemed to have remembered something. He walked to the cabinet, opened it, and took out the other 3 secret books that he had hidden deep inside the cabinet. He had only flipped through these books at first, but when he looked at them again, he found that the movements of the men and women in them were a bit strange, and the thin and light red lines on their bodies did not seem to be caused by piracy. If the 3-cent books were the secret books that even Tang Yajing valued, then what were the 3 Liang silver books? The peerless martial arts that could defeat all opponents in the martial arts world after practicing? Even if Tang Ning was a pig, he would understand at this time that these 3 secret books were definitely not as simple as a fight between 2 people. However, he himself did not have the knowledge reserve in this area, so he needed to find someone to identify them first. Tang Yao Yao was obviously not the best candidate. She hid in the room with his wife's best friend to study pornographic books. Tang Ning's innocence was ruined by Qing Er the day after he entered the mansion. He could not ruin Tang Yejing's innocence as well, otherwise she would not be able to get married, and it would become his fault. Take a look first. I'll be out for a while. Tang Ning looked at her and walked out with the 3 secret books. In addition to Tang Yejing, Peng Chen is also a trustworthy person. It's better for 2 men to read this kind of thing than 1 man and 1 woman. Tang Yao Yao looked at him and asked, "Where are you going?" "I bought these books in the same place." Tang Ning raised the book in his hand and explained, "I'll ask Peng Chen if these 3 books are also secret books." Tang Yao Yao recognized the book in his hand and blushed. She thought for a while and said, "Give it to me." "Let me see." "You?" Tang Ning asked uncertainly. Tang Yao Yao looked calm, nodded, and said, "People who practice martial arts don't care about trivial matters. If you don't care about trivial matters, then don't care about trivial matters. Why blush?" Tang Ning handed the 3 booklets to her, then walked out of the room and walked to the yard to avoid suspicion. After a while, Tang Yao Yao came out and returned the 3 secret books to Tang Ning, asking, "Where did you buy these secret books?" Tang Ning looked at her and asked in surprise, "Are those 3 also martial arts secret books?" Tang Yao Yao nodded with a slightly red face. Although Tang Ning was still a rookie in the martial arts world, no matter how he looked at it, that thing didn't look like something that could be used to practice martial arts, right? Tang Yao Yao looked a little embarrassed and explained, "That's a double cultivation secret book." Tang Ning knew about double cultivation, which was often written in novels. The male and female protagonists could achieve harmony between their lives and improve their martial arts skills by relying on double cultivation techniques. Many rapists liked this kind of tune, but they were doing evil things of taking yin to replenish yang, while his was a serious double cultivation technique. However, thinking carefully, there was no use for him to have this thing. Double cultivation, this requires 2 martial artists to practice, not only martial artists, but also husband and wife. He and Zhongyi still sleep in separate rooms, and they have to wait at least half a year before they can get married and spend the wedding night together. What's more, she doesn't practice martial arts. Who should he practice this dual cultivation technique with? It can't be with Tang Yejing. Tang Ning looked at Tang Yao Yao and her face turned red. Tang Yao Yao frowned and asked, "What are you thinking about?" No. Tang Ning shook his head repeatedly, clearing those shameful images from his mind, and said, "These books were bought from an old beggar." Tang Yejing was a little impatient and said, "Then let's go quickly, maybe he has such good things there." Tang Ning didn't know whether she was naive or stupid. The secret book was important, but more important was the person who sold the secret book. If you know everything, you can't do anything well. When martial arts are practiced to a high level, you don't care what moves others use or what weapons they use. No matter how many punches or kicks he uses, or how many swords or spears he uses, it's just a knife. This is what the old beggar said. At that time, I thought he was just talking nonsense. Now thinking about it, I suddenly felt a sense of mastery coming to me. This is a real master from the world. The old beggar's regular begging place is a corner next to the breakfast shop of the 3rd uncle. A few days ago, he gave part of his territory to the 2 mother and daughter beggars from other places, on the condition that they must give him a bun every day. When Tang Ning and Tang Yao Yao went there this time, they didn't see the old beggar. "You mean that shameless old guy?" The 3rd uncle wiped the table and shook his head, saying, "I haven't seen him for 2 days. I don't know where he went." Tang Ning found Lu Lao, and he also said he didn't know. He also said that the old beggar would disappear for a while from time to time, sometimes for 1 or 2 days, sometimes for several days, and the longest time was more than a month. At that time, Lu Lao and the others thought he was dead outside, but a few days later, he appeared in the corner again and continued to cheat children's money. Tang Ning wondered in his heart whether the old beggar took the 10 taels of silver and ran away to live happily outside. Not finding the old beggar, Tang Yao Yao was a little disappointed, but soon cheered up and said, "Those secret books are not simple, we will start practicing tomorrow." Ah, Tang Ning stared at her with wide eyes and said in shock, we. Tang Yao Yao looked at him and asked, "Don't you want to practice?" Tang Ning looked embarrassed and said, "This is not good." "What's wrong?" Tang Yao Yao was stunned, and immediately thought of what he said. With a red face, she stepped hard on his instep and said angrily, "I'm talking about the other books." Tang Yajing left angrily. Tang Ning looked at her back in confusion. She didn't say clearly, so how could she know which books she was talking about? He walked to the next shop and said, "Old Zheng, bring me half a pound of lean meat stuffing later. I'll use it for making dumplings in the evening. Remember to chop it finely." Butcher Zheng waved his hand at him and said, "Okay. When it comes to meat stuffing for making dumplings, it's still the best at Butcher Zheng's." According to him, his ancestors for 3 generations were butchers, and the skill of chopping meat stuffing was inherited from the family, unique in Lingzhou City. Butcher Zheng chopped the meat. When Tang Ning paid, he waved his hand and smiled, "It's not much meat, so you don't have to pay. I'm going to the restaurant to deliver the meat later. Mr. Tang, help me look after Nanan for a while." Tang Ning didn't bother to be polite with him. She threw the money directly into the drawer and said, "You go. I'll take her to Zairu's shop later. Nanan is the daughter of Butcher Zheng. The little girl is very obedient and doesn't need to be taken care of." Tang Ning brought Nanan to the cloth shop. She held the doll in her arms and played with it by herself. Several girls in the shop came to tease her from time to time, while Tang Ning continued to copy the article. This method was taught to him by Li Tianlan. She said that when she was a child, she started by copying. After copying more, she learned grammar by herself. Tang Ning thought this method was feasible, so he learned it and practiced calligraphy at the same time. He wanted to wait until March to set off for the capital, but his father-in-law said that the capital was not like Lingzhou, so it was better to go there early to adapt to the environment of the capital first, and let him leave after the new year. Tang Ning finally delayed until after the Lantern Festival, but he could not delay any longer. Before this, he only knew that the capital was the capital of the state of Chen, which was much more prosperous than Lingzhou, but he had never been there. He didn't know what the legendary capital looked like. The capital, Tang Mansion. The girl walked briskly towards a quiet courtyard. When she saw a man coming towards her, she stopped and said immediately, "Uncle." Tang Hui looked at her and nodded slightly. The girl passed him and walked a few steps. She seemed to remember something and looked back again. She said in surprise, "Strange, where did Hanbo go? Why didn't he stay with uncle? I haven't seen him for several days." Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 100. The girl looked at the direction where Tang Hui disappeared, murmured in confusion, then shook her head, gently knocked on the door of a quiet courtyard, and walked in slowly. There was a woman sitting in the pavilion in the courtyard. The woman was beautiful and sat there quietly. She seemed to be only a few years older than the girl who entered the courtyard, but from the little things revealed in her absent-minded eyes, she seemed to be a generation older than her. It was difficult to tell her real age just from her appearance. The girl looked at the woman in the pavilion, and doubts appeared on her pretty face again. Hanbo, who had always been inseparable from her uncle, had disappeared for several days, and her aunt was rarely sewing clothes in the yard. Her father seemed to have something on his mind, sometimes frowning, sometimes smiling. These days, she always felt that the atmosphere in the Tang mansion was a little wrong. She asked her father, but her father didn't tell her a word. Although she still didn't know anything, she was sure that something must have happened. She walked to the pavilion, sat beside the woman, hugged her arm, and said in a tender voice, "Little aunt." The woman withdrew her gaze from the front, tilted her head to look at her, and asked, "What's wrong? Who bullied you again?" In this capital, only Miss Tang bullies others, who can bully her. As soon as the woman finished speaking, a voice came from the door. Tang Jing walked into the gate, turned back and closed the courtyard door from the inside, and then walked towards the side. The girl looked at Tang Jing and said dissatisfiedly, "Dad, how can you say that to your daughter? Although I am not your and mother's biological child, I have been with you for 18 years. Tang Jing glanced at her and said, "I have something to say to your aunt, you go out first." "You talk, I'm here, I promise not to interrupt." The girl pointed to the direction of the courtyard door and said, "And the door is closed. If I go out now, you will have to go over and close it again, which is so troublesome." Tang Jing thought about it and felt that what she said made sense. He pointed to the courtyard wall and said, "Then you can climb over the wall and go out." Sure enough, the adopted one is different from the biological one. The girl said depressedly and walked towards the courtyard wall. The woman looked at Tang Jing, shook her head, and said, "Forget it, third brother, let Shui stay." The girl immediately ran back, sat beside the woman, took her arm again, looked at Tang Jing, blinked, and said, "Dad, you can talk." Tang Jing secretly glared at her, but no longer insisted. He looked at the girl and said, "You can't let a fourth person know what happened today, especially your uncle, understand?" The girl nodded and said, "Don't worry, even if my mother asks me, I won't tell her." Tang Jing nodded, breathed a sigh of relief, looked at the girl, smiled, and said, "I went to find Fang Hong and learned a lot about him. He is in Lingzhou, and he is the champion of this Lingzhou provincial examination. He ranked first in every provincial examination. Minister Fang praised him highly. He wrote excellent poems and was good at policy essays. He was strongly recommended by 3 inspectors. He is already married. His wife is known as the first talented woman in Lingzhou and is also a well-educated and well-mannered woman. He will be born in March next year at the latest. I'm going to the capital to take the provincial exam." Tang Jing took out a piece of paper from his sleeve and said, "I also copied the 2 poems he wrote in the state exam from Fang Hong. Take a look. They are well written, but a little nonsense. Imperial examination poems have always been serious, but he wrote about women's feelings." The woman took the paper and looked at it almost impatiently. Her hands trembled a little and she murmured, "All good, all good." The girl looked at Tang Jing talking non-stop, but the confusion on her face became deeper and deeper. Finally, she couldn't help but turned her head and asked, "Auntie, who is he?" When you don't need something, it will appear in front of you all the time, and when you need it, you can't find it even if you search the whole world. This is the damn Murphy's Law. Although the old beggar is not a thing, the meaning is the same. These days, he seems to have evaporated from the face of the earth and completely disappeared from Tang Ning's world. Tang Ning was a little puzzled. No matter how much trouble he made for the 10 taels of silver, he should have done it, right? He shook his head helplessly and opened a tattered book in his hand. He had already memorized the moves in this book, but of course they were just for show. Tang Yejing said that some advanced martial arts require unique mental methods to exert 100% of their power. Without mental methods, the power exerted is less than 50%. Speaking of Tang Yejing, Tang Ning felt a little regretful. If she didn't know about the secret book, he could practice secretly and surpass her secretly, turning over a new leaf and holding his head high. From then on, Tang Yejing could only bow down to him. But if the two practiced together, the gap would only be infinitely widened. Tang Ning knew that he could not compare with Tang Yejing in terms of foundation or talent. But if there was no Tang Yejing, these tattered books might have been thrown away by him as garbage, and there would be no current situation. This is a paradox. Tang Ning was depressed for a while and stopped thinking about it. It had been raining for several days in a row and it hadn't stopped yet. The room was a little stuffy, so Tang Ning went out to get some fresh air. Just then I saw Tang Yao Yao walking in from outside. The road was slippery due to the rain and the walls were also wet. She had been walking on the right path these days. She walked to the corridor, looked around, and secretly took out an envelope from her sleeve, handed it to him, and said, "Your letter." Tang Ning was a little surprised. They were so close, what could Tang Yejing say that couldn't be said in person, and needed to be written on paper, and it looked so sneaky? Tang Yao Yao saw him looking at her in confusion and explained, "Xiao, I gave it to you. If it was Honggai, it would be even more strange." They lived under the same roof every day, ate at the same table, talked and flirted every night, and they were just short of sleeping in the same bed. What was there to say in the letter? He glanced at the envelope and understood it when he saw Li Qing's personal letter on it. This was all Tang Yejing's sin. When he received the letter, his identity was Tang Yejing's cousin. The sinful Tang Yejing turned them into sisters. Tang Ning returned to the room and opened the letter. Most of what Zhongyi said in the letter was her admiration for Li Qing's literary talent. She also attached a few of her newly written poems and asked her to correct them. This was a mutual attraction between talented women. Zhongyi really wanted to make friends with Li Qing. Although Tang Ning could ignore the letter and not receive a reply, Zhongyi would naturally not write again. But in this case, she would inevitably feel disappointed. When she wrote this letter, she also mustered up a lot of courage. Tang Ning didn't want to see her disappointed, so he spread out the paper, picked up the pen and started to reply. Knowing that she had committed a serious sin, Tang Yao Yao stood beside him and helped him grind ink. He naturally wanted to respond to Zhongyi's enthusiasm with enthusiasm, and made some small suggestions for her work, and then attached a few of Li Qingzhao's early works and asked her to comment. After writing the letter and waiting for the ink to dry, he put it in an envelope and handed it to Tang Yejing. One was her best friend and the other was his cousin. Tang Yejing was the middleman between them. After doing these things, he went out with an umbrella. It had been raining for the past few days, and there were not many pedestrians on the street. Uncle San's business was also affected, and he would close the stall early. When Tang Ning walked over, Fang Xiaopang was helping Uncle San to clean up the inventory. The buns that could not be sold out on the same day could not be sold the next day. Since he vomited twice after eating, Uncle San generously distributed them to beggars nearby. No beggar would come out to beg in such weather, and Fang Xiaopang was just in use. Tang Ning unexpectedly met Li Tianlan here. He closed his umbrella and put it in the corner. Li Tianlan came over, handed him a piece of paper, and said, "I have figured out that problem." Tang Ning looked at it and thought that Miss Li's top scorer should not be exaggerated. In the absence of a lot of basic knowledge, she actually sorted out the logic and order. This means that she is going to bother him again. Tang Ning thought for a moment and said, "I have another 7 bridges problem here. Brother Li, do you want to hear it?" Li Tianlan looked more haggard than in the past few days. Hearing this, he immediately waved his hand and said, "No, we'll talk about it later when we have a chance." Tang Ning shook his head. Seeing that the rain outside was getting heavier, he walked over and rubbed Fang Xiaopang's head and said, "Don't eat any more. I'll take you back." He looked at Li Tianlan again and asked, "Brother Li, the post house is also on the way. Why don't we go together?" Li Tianlan nodded. Fang Xiaopang took 2 more buns, held up an umbrella, and walked out of the store with Tang Ning. The rain was getting heavier. It took a long time to see pedestrians on the long street. They hurried past with umbrellas. Several figures wearing straw raincoats walked out of a tea house somewhere.